Solutions.com.
21st Century Radio is sponsored by Hieronymus and Company. Now more of 21st Century Radio with your host, Dr. Bob Hieronymus.
I am a human. Well, I am a child like her. And if you look into my eyes, deep down there's a light. I'm not a Christian. I'm not a Muslim. I'm not a Jew. It shouldn't matter to you. I'm not a capitalist, and I'm not a communist. I'm not a socialist. I'm not the politics. Tell me, are these the reasons you can't live right? I am a human.
Well, you're listening to Brother Ziggy Martin, Ziggy Marley. A good friend of ours who will be joining us up at Woodstock, hopefully, not hopefully, but we'll have the bus up at that time, and he wants a ride in it, and so does Janie Hendricks. Yes, she wants a ride too, and they'll all be up there, and we'll all be partying pretty hard up there, and about a little over a year or something from now. Now, our guest, of course, is Laird Scranton, Decoding Maori Cosmology, the ancient origins of New Zealand's indigenous culture, inner traditions, and you can follow him on his active Facebook page. And we got a number of questions, and I better not talk too much here, even though there's something I need to say near the end of the show. Some Maori myths reflect the archaic symbolism in odd ways, as in the gender of various gods. Would you give us some examples?
Well, I had made the reference earlier about the deity in the Maori culture who was talked about as being male, but there was a surviving myth that said that he was given as a bride to another male deity, and the indication is we might have had an original myth that was matriarchal, not patriarchal. But you see other indications of that same effect. There are certain rituals in Maori culture that require the presence of a female elder, even though quite often she's not allowed to conduct the ceremony. Her presence is required in order to be able to conduct it. I see that as a remnant of a matriarchal culture. We also have certain myths that tie back to the archaic era, to the Gobekli Tepe era. In Dogon culture, the symbolic tradition is sometimes referred to as the basket cosmology. There's a famous episode when the French anthropologist was being initiated in the Dogon tradition. He was working with a blind Dogon priest, and the priest was trying to explain to him what shape the shrine, the Dogon aligned shrine that's like a Buddhist stupa, it's called a granary shrine, what shape that had. And so he reached back into his hut, which was behind him, and fumbled around with his hand until he found a wicker basket that had a square base and a round top. Mm-hmm. And he turned it upside down and set it on the ground and said, here's what the shape we're trying to represent with the granary shrine. So the Dogon cosmology is sometimes referred to as the basket cosmology. You also have a lot of controversy about what look like handbags or hand baskets that are pictured in various cultures on carved scenes, where a reptilian-looking creature or some other creature is seen to be holding something that looks like a handbag or a basket. You've got, on the Gobekli Tepe pillars, you have three what look like handbag shapes. It's a semicircle shape sitting on top of a square, basically, that was carved into three of them in a row. Now, in ancient times, three domes or three hemispheres were symbolic of a sanctuary. There's a type of an ancient shrine in the Fertile Crescent region called a chaitya that was characterized by three domes. The reason for that is because I said the circle is symbolic of the non-material and the square is symbolic of the material. So A sanctuary is a place where the non-material and the material are said to come together. So the symbol for that is to try to reconcile the shape of a circle with the shape of a square. And the hemisphere does that, and these seemingly handbag-shaped basket shapes also do it. They have a hemisphere on top, which is circular, and a square on bottom that is square. You see it in China, where the first mother of goddess and creator god are she's holding a compass to measure the circularity of the heavens, and he's holding a carpenter's square to measure the squareness of the earth. Those survived arguably as Masonic symbols.
Mm-hmm.
So in Maori culture, we have a myth where a departmental deity named Tane is said to ascend to the gods and returns back with 3 baskets full of knowledge. And I see that as a potential reference to those 3 handbag or basket shapes that identify the Gobekli Tepe site, which was a mountaintop shrine, as a sanctuary. You have a number of references in Maori culture that do that, where we could tag it to a particular era of the tradition through a myth. But you have to be aware of the symbolic reversals that have happened. Mm-hmm. That the name of a male deity or departmental god in the Maori tradition is a likely correlate to the name of a female goddess in one of the archaic traditions. In the Shakti cult honors 2 sister goddesses. When you hear sister goddesses, you think the 2 stars of Sirius, like Isis and Nephthys in Egypt Isis represented the Sirius star, and she was said to have a dark sister named Nephthys. So the Shakti cult goddesses, one of them is named Tana Penu, the other one is called Daharni Penu. And Tana Penu has a name that is phonetically quite similar to Tane, who is the departmental god for the Maori, with similar actions attributed in both cases, flipping the male to female role, which, as I said, is symbolic reversal. So we have a whole bunch of that happening in the Maori tradition. We even have connections to Judaism in the Maori, and to potentially the Christianity. We have to the almost parallel quotes to the book of Genesis, the opening of the book of Genesis, about the creation of the universe from light. God Yahu, or for the Maori the name is spelled I-O. Phonetically, we can see a comparison to the term Yah. Essentially hovers over the face of the waters, and in the metaphor of the cosmology, wakens a sleeping goddess, gets her to open her eyes and perceive light. That's the generic version of the myth. So we have lots of really interesting connections. Some of them that pass through the Dogon, some of them that appear through the Shakti cult, and you really have to compare all those eras to get a complete picture of how did we get this conglomerate of things appear in New Zealand at 1200, 1100, 1200 AD.
In several ancient traditions, the mythological concept of an underworld also referred to a geographical locale that symbolized it. What are some of the reasons to associate Orkney Island with ancient Egyptian and Greek concepts of the underworld in the archaic area?
When we look at the structures on Orkney Island that I said were an alphabet of stages of creation, they end at 8 chambers at the Skara village on Orkney Island, which is representative of a primary structure of matter for the Dogon, called the Po Pilu. But there are additional stages that continue on up to a structure that's equivalent to an atom, which is the Po I was talking about earlier. So I wondered if there had been an attempt to represent the next stage beyond those clustered chambers on Orkney. Now, what the next stage would be for the Dogon is an attempt to represent the concept of what are called fundamental particles. And for scientists, fundamental particles appear against the background of what they refer to as the background field. These are particles, they're Stephen Hawking says there are more than 200 of them. The Dogon say there are 266 of them. Now, the way the Dogon represent that is at the time of the planting of the seeds for the harvest, they go to the field of their top priest, who's called the Aru priest, and they make what is essentially a crop circle in his field and draw zigzag lines in it that represent vibrations of matter. Mm-hmm. So we have, I was considering, at the time I was thinking about this, I thought I was seeing Egyptian influences on Orkney, when in fact what I believe I'm seeing is Orkney influences on Egypt. So I thought, so this wouldn't have been a Dogon concept, it would have been an Egyptian concept. So I started looking for comparable ideas in Egypt. The Egyptian word for field is seket, and the seket eru in Egypt is the concept of the field of reeds, essentially the concept of the underworld or of a place where the pharaoh's soul would depart to when he died. So for the Dogon, they treat it as a cosmological concept, but it also is handled on a second level as an actual field where they go and they do things. The Egyptians treat it as a mythological or cosmological concept. They write about it in the Egyptian Book of the Dead, and they picture animals that are appropriate to Orkney, and they picture scenes that are appropriate to Orkney. They handle it on two levels, as if it were a real-world geographic place as well as being a concept. The same concept got passed down to the ancient Greeks as the Elysian fields. And for the Greeks, they also dealt with it on two levels. They treated it as if it were a mythological concept, but they also write about it as if it's a real geographic place. And they go so far as to actually describe where it sits and what the attributes of it are. And they're describing a white island, and Orkney is an island characterized by brilliant white beaches, situated on the western or the far eastern side of the Western Ocean, which is where Orkney is located. They describe it as being a place of great winds, which Orkney is. That's its primary weather feature, is its high winds. And Pindar even goes so far as to refer to it as Okeanos, which is phonetically pretty close to Orkney. So we have this term Aru that associates with Orkney Island because of this concept of the Seket Eru, or the field of the Eru priest, for the Dogon. When you look at it from Maori perspective, their memory of their revered school that was situated far to the east from them was called Whare Kura. From my perspective, the Whare piece of that is the equivalent of that term Aru. And on Orkney, as far back as anybody remembers, the key religious sanctuary on Orkney was a church that was situated in the primary town on Orkney called Kirkwall, but originally it was called Kirkwa. So Aru Kirkwa, over thousands of years, could reasonably become Whare Kura. So that's one of the suggestive pieces that plays into trying to connect what the Maori are talking about to what other cultures are saying, looks like happened in the Orkney region at an era hundreds or thousands of years before the Maori arrived in New Zealand.
And we talked a little bit about reversals, and but with symbolic reversals, concepts of the upper south and the lower north flip, what do you mean by that, and how does it affect the interpretation of the Egyptian name for New Zealand?
There are a number of confusing representations that we see, especially with with symbols that we understand to be archaic. We know that in Egyptian culture, their concept of things was the reverse of ours. We tend to think of north as being up and south as being down.
Yeah.
For the Egyptians, south was upper and north was lower.
Yeah, that always used to confuse me.
The Dogon have a number of things they describe. They talk about how their creator god, Amma, formed the universes. He began by facing west, and he turned to the right and was now facing south. And I thought, that's not right. South is not, you would have to turn to the left in order to face south. You've got representations of the Yuga cycle in Buddhism, where it's as if this circular symbol of the Yuga cycle incorporates a number of different elements, including the constellations. But where the constellations are placed is reversed from what we expect it to be. They have, based on the outlook of what they present, we would now not be coming out of the age of Pisces into the age of Aquarius, but exactly 180 degrees opposite of that. Mm-hmm. And so it's as if the perspective was either from outside looking in, or that it was inside looking out, but in a reversed way from how we look at it. We've got a star chart on the ceiling of the Temple of Dendera in Egypt that represents the stars not the way they look in from Egypt right now. They represent stars the way they look from the southern hemisphere, not the northern. The Egyptians also flatly say that 3 times in their historical memory, the memory of their culture, the sun rose where it formerly set. They're talking about reversals. Mm-hmm. The Chinese talk about it. Mm-hmm. At one point, the Chinese say the sun disappeared and was gone for several days, and all of the advisors were debating as to where the sun was going to reappear when it came back, and not one of them guessed that it would be in the east. So we have lots of indications. We have Native American lore about the stars falling. If you had a flip in the axis of the Earth happen, a physical flip in the axis of the Earth, at night, it would look as if the stars were moving.
Well, we have to flip our axis right now and take a break. And when we come back, before we come back, we'll be giving away a copy of your book.
Oh, great.
Talking with Laird Scranton, Decoding Maori Cosmology, the Ancient Origins of New Zealand's Indigenous Culture, published by Inner Traditions. Slumbering back into previous lifetimes here on 21st Century Radio. How would you like to win a free copy of the book that we're talking about? Huh? It's called Decoding Maori Cosmology, the Ancient Origins of New Zealand's Indigenous Culture. And of course, it's by our friend Laird Scranton. And it's published by, you guessed it, International Traditions Associations. Well, if you know the answer to this hour's trivia question, you will win that book. Here's the question. Do you know who was our first guest the last time, listen carefully, the last time I was live on 21st Century Radio? Well, if you know that, you're going to win, but you're going to have to qualify first. Here's how to qualify.
If you know the answer to this hour's quiz question on 21st Century Radio and you have not won from us in the last 60 days, call in now. 410-922-6680. That's 410-WCBM-680. First with the right answer wins. Prizes are available for you to pick up at the WCBM studios in Pikesville after Friday of this week. Winners have 60 days to pick up the prizes and must wait 60 days before winning another prize from 21st Century Radio. Good luck.
Hi, my name is Her Excellency Aina Olomo. I'm a Yoruba priestess, and you are listening to 21st Century Radio with Dr. Bob Hieronymus.
Gosh, Rudy, boy, we haven't talked to her for a long time. There's nothing like having one of the queens join you on 21st Century Radio. Well, our guest, of course, is Laird Scranton. The book, of course, is Decoding Maori Cosmology, the Ancient Origins of New Zealand's Indigenous Culture and Her Traditions. The next question, and if you can answer this question, we're going to give you a free trip to Bermuda and a couple of carrots or something like that, something along the side. You ready for it?
Yep.
Okay, I know you're a little bit frightened now, but you can get this right. Mythical characters or deities of the Maori tradition often align in name, role, and action with those of other ancient traditions. How do they line up with the Book of Genesis, for example?
Well, I mentioned the example of the grand deity of the Maori tradition is recognized by researchers as being Io, which I take to be the correlate to Yah in the Hebrew tradition, Yah or Yahweh. We also have other references that pass down through Orkney that pertain to El, who was a god of space in the Palestine region, who was a counterpart to Yah, being a god of light. We have connections to those through the Maori that go along with the Book of Genesis that make it sound like they came out of the same tradition. It's not actually the Book of Genesis. It's just Maori, we'll say, ritual chants that repeat information that agrees with the Book of Genesis. That sound, if you didn't know better, you might imagine that it had come from the Book of Genesis. Mm-hmm. The Dogon perspective on all of that is really a metaphor that's used to describe how processes of creation happen. This is, in the Dogon perspective, this is scientific information. It's talking about a relationship between the non-material and the material, and that processes of creation are catalyzed when energies from the two universes come together. When that happens, the non-material is described as a sleeping goddess, and the act of material creation is described as an awakening. We find out in another book that I've written about subjects about these concepts of creation that metaphor actually has some realistic application, that these concepts of awakening have some literal pertinence to the dynamics that are going on. There are cycles that resemble cycles of sleep, energetic cycles that resemble energetic cycles of sleep. So the Maori tradition does not conceptualize, according to the beliefs of Elston Best and Edward Tregear, we're not seeing, and others, we're not seeing deification of a god in the same sense that modern religions understand it. From the Dogon perspective, when we talk about worshiping a god, they talk about celebrating it, right. Celebrating a concept. Mm-hmm. We have naming conventions for ancient tribes that essentially declare what aspect of this creation tradition they major in, like a college student. It declares which aspect their tribe is focused on celebrating. There's an ancient word for celebrate that's the Egyptian word that is Sakai, S-K-H-A-I is how it's transliterated. In the Dogon culture, it's Sigi. In China, it's transliterated as Xe or Khi. The Naki in Tibet celebrate Na, who is that Na is a term that refers to the mother goddess. We have the Ama-Ziggy tribes prior to ancient Egypt. Ama is the name of a creator god. Ziggy is a word that means to celebrate. You even come down to groups like the ancient tribal name for Judaism. In Judaism was Yahuda. Yah is the name of the light god. Huda is a word that means to praise. In ancient Egypt, we have a tribal name, Mir Ra, means celebrates Ra or praises Ra. Those naming conventions hold together from culture to culture around the world in different situations, and anytime we bump up against one of them, we understand that we're dealing. That's one of the signatures of the tradition. Mm-hmm. The Skara Brae village on Orkney Island sits on the Bay of Skael. Skael celebrates El. El is the god of space that is a counterpart to the god of light in the Hebrew tradition, or Palestine, in the area of Palestine in early eras.
Well, congratulations. We're going to send you a free trip to Bermuda for that. And but you won't be able to take anybody else with you. You got to go by yourself. That's the only limitations. And they're
I have to travel through
I'm sorry. That's the way it goes, you know. You got to make it there yourself. There, we never said we were going to fund it. We were just going to send you there. Thank you. I appreciated that. Now, traditional village schools of the Maori for the education of priests provide credible links to Ireland, to the Dogon, and to ancient Egypt. I was amazed at this particular stuff. How so?
Well, we have in Ireland, archaeologists are confused because the most prolific architectural form they keep turning up is represented by stones that have been set in a horseshoe shape. They find it everywhere throughout Ireland. They have no idea what it represents. For the Maori, the village schools were traditionally laid out that way, with stones set in a horseshoe shape. And so there are linguistic links also. In Ireland, these sites are referred to as Fulachta Fiad. If we interpret that not in terms of languages in Ireland, but in terms of the archaic language in the Orkney region called the Faroese language, the terms can mean folk academy, which would seem like an appropriate name for a village school.
Yeah.
Those schools, as the Maori described them, have many things in common with the Dogon and other cultures who we know what their practices were. There were schools associated with every Egyptian temple. There was they were referred to as House of Life and a House of Books. One was basically a school that taught scribes how to write Egyptian hieroglyphic language, and the other was a school that taught the same kinds of civilizing skills that the Maori are teaching. The Maori term for their priestly class can mean firstborn, the same way we hear the term firstborn in Egypt connected to the episode of Exodus from Egypt. The firstborn male child in a Maori household had the option to be educated as a priest. So if we look at things in that way and believe that there's a connection there, then we go back to the tale of the Exodus from Egypt, and when they talk about a plague that killed the firstborn, we can easily imagine that was an attempt against the priestly class in Egypt.
I am aware that we have only 24 minutes.
Okay.
And I'm scared to pieces because I have so many other questions. Really, and there's some things one thing I've got to get to eventually, and will perhaps. One of the last things I wanted to talk about was the pneumo, and something that I've discovered that I'd like to share with you and our audience. But how did you discover that the Maori language is formulated on the same phonetics as the language of the Dogon tribe in Africa, and how does that help your research?
Well, when I first started researching the Maori book, I didn't have enough of an overview of the various languages involved in ancient creation traditions to be able to really evaluate the dictionary. By the time I finally did get to it, this is the 9th book in the series. I had thought about writing it as the second book in the series. By the 9th book in the series, based on the Dogon phonetics and based on phonetics out of the other languages I was talking about, a very large percentage of the Maori words made sense to me in terms of how they were formulated. And one of the first things I did was sit down with the dictionary, which is a comparative Maori Polynesian dictionary to English. So Tregear gives us not only what the Maori meaning is for a particular word, but what other related Polynesian meanings are for the same word. We have a cosmological tradition with the Maori that has elements of it are seen with every other Polynesian group across the Pacific. The Maori had an advantage of being isolated for a very long period of time, and so may have seen later corruption by outside influences. They might have gone for a longer period of time without outside influences corrupting the tradition. Language is a really significant way to be able to triangulate in on things. I mentioned that in native form, these words pertain to clusters of meanings, not just a single meaning. A linguist says, linguists tend to say that in your average language, you're only trying to represent 40 phonetic values. And so the chances of two disconnected cultures using the same spoken word to represent the same concept are pretty high. There's a pretty high chance you're going to have a coincidence where the words aren't really related etymologically, but they are related, but they look like they're related because they're pronounced the same way. Well, these clustered meanings give us a method of correlating between languages that doesn't depend on standard etymology. If we have two gods, Amma, the hidden god for the Dogon, and Amen, the hidden god for the Egyptians, and we notice that they hold the same position in relation to the entire cosmology. They're credited with the same acts. Their names also are associated with multiple other meanings. They also means to grasp, to hold firm, or to establish. In fact, the word Amen in Hebrew, the word that follows at the end of a prayer, comes from a root that means to establish. And so these clusters of meanings allow us to positively correlate the names of the deities. It would be sort of ridiculous to say that Amen and Amma correlate in every way except language, and that for some reason we're disallowed to also say that the names relate to each other. Clearly they do. Everything else does too. So language is really important here, and simply, if the only resource I had for the Maori tradition was their dictionary, I could have made a very high percentage of the connections that I have made in the book simply from language.
That is fascinating to me. It really is. But we got to take a final break here on 21st Century Radio. And when we come back, you will have noted that the mythical teachers of the Dogon were known as the Numo. A corresponding ancient Egyptian word, Nema, means pygmy. But I'd like to discuss that with you because I found some information that I'm dying to ask you about. We'll be back with Laird Scranton, Decoding Maori Cosmology, the ancient origins of New Zealand's indigenous culture and her traditions.
Hello, this is Professor Joy Porter, author of Land and Spirits in Native America, which is available on Amazon.com. You are listening to 21st Century Radio with Dr. Bob Hieronymus.
Welcome back. Our guest is Laird Scranton. We're running out of time, so I'm going right to it. The question I asked you for $30,000 is the mythical teachers of the Dogon were known as Numo, N-U-M-M-O. A corresponding ancient Egyptian word is Nema, N-E-M-M-A, and means pygmy. Could you give us a little bit of information on this before I ask you something I've been wanting to ask you for only 17 years?
Sure. We have to understand the phonetics, especially of any of the hieroglyphic languages that omitted vowel sounds. Those are guesstimates. They aren't sure how they were pronounced. So substituting one vowel or another might be reasonable. So the Dogon word numo relates in a couple of ways to the Egyptian language. One is it relates to the term nu-ma. Nu is a word that means waves, and ma is a word for perception. So in the Dogon outlook that their teachers were originally non-material, the idea of waves being perceived, the way a particle is a wave perceived, could make sense. Now, on Orkney, the earliest sagas, Scandinavian sagas, reported finding two groups living side by side on Orkney. One was a group of pygmies of very strange habits, and the other were a group of average-sized clerics who always wore white, like the Dogon do, and who were described as being so different from the Scandinavians as to constitute a different race. So there's a possibility that these sagas caught the Dogon with their Numo teachers on Orkney. Possible confirmation of that comes out of the Egyptian language, where, as you say, the word Nema means pygmy. So all of that sort of ties together. That's the basic rationale linguistically for what we're talking about with the Dogon teachers.
Now, what I bumped into some time ago with this name Numo, there is a book, actually 2 books, by Shannon Dory. Have you ever heard? You know her?
Yes, I know of her. I've been in contact with her in the past.
You have? Wow, you lucky guy. And no, well, I mean, you know, because she's done 2 books. One is called The Master of Speech. Have you read that?
I have a copy of it, actually.
You've got a copy of The Master of Speech?
Uh-huh.
Do you know how much they cost now, if you can get it?
No idea. I have a copy on my shelf in the next room.
$203.
Wow.
$203. Her second book is The Numo, and that's 1950, and that's still available. That's considerable. But she just, how she describes what the Numo look like, and has some drawings and paintings, especially on the cover of the book. What do you think of those designs, those drawings?
My perspective comes out of the final anthropological study that was done by the French anthropologists about the Dogon. If you read articles, the way the esoteric tradition works in various cultures, including the Maori, an initiate isn't really told the straight truth about certain things until they're very close to finishing their initiation. So if you read articles from the French anthropologists that were written in 1950, you get a very different picture of certain concepts than if you work from their final anthropological study, which was written around 1960. So Robert Temple's book was written before there was an English language translation of that full anthropological study, and so he represented things in a particular way that align with some of the earlier articles, but don't really align with the final anthropological study, the final understanding that these researchers came to about what the Dogon meanings were isn't reflected in those earlier articles. So it's easy to confuse what might be given as an allegorical explanation or a metaphorical explanation as a literal explanation. So Temple's perspective was we were looking at sci-fi style aliens from Sirius.
Mm-hmm.
When you get down into the comparative details of the cosmology with how the Kabbalists understand it and other cultures understand it compared to how the Dogon see it, you realize that the significance of the Dogon doesn't look like it has to do with off-planet aliens. It looks like it has to do with, they represent it as having to do with an inter-universe contact, not an off-universe contact.
Mm-hmm.
The mindset is that universes form in pairs, and that there's a cycle of energy between universes, and that certain points in that cycle it's possible to interact between them. So because I'm coming at it from a different set of assumptions, I arrive at a different set of conclusions. So very often I'm off track with both Temple and with Shannon Dory in terms of how we interpret certain things the Dogon say. And I try my best to allow for the fact that multiple perspectives on a thing is a good thing.
Well, the description that she has of the beings with Numo, where they were very somewhat fish-like and had scales, and kind of like a cow front nose. Now, some time ago, many years ago, we did a show on a Canadian sea serpent, which is now officially recognized by science as the Cadborosaurus wilsey, a new genus, a new species.
Uh-huh.
And this was 2 doctors, doctors Paul LeBlanc and Edward L. Boosfield, who discovered it. And I saw it looks to me that these could be similar to what is described by Shannon Dory. And that's basically, I was so excited to see how this all came together, because this being that they saw is not, this Cadborosaurus is not very, there aren't many of them. There's only maybe a couple that have ever been seen, and fortunately, as you might know, they actually have a photo of a carcass of a real one that they discovered.
Wow, that's really, really cool. That'd be interesting if there were a connection to that.
Well, so I'm going to copy this and send this on to you, and maybe we can talk about that.
Yeah, great. I'd love to look into it and see what kind of connections I could see.
I can't tell you how excited I was to see this. Yeah, I
know how you feel, because you see something that is that strikes you intuitively as being a resemblance, and it makes every sense to pursue it and see how it connects.
Yeah. Well, we're going to try to reach Shannon Dory to have her on 21st Century Radio. Maybe you could help us with an address with that later on, because is she still alive?
To my knowledge, she still is. It's been years since I had email contacts with her, so I'm presuming she still is.
Well, would you help us along on that line?
Sure.
Great.
Absolutely.
Thank you. I'm sorry I had to bring this up, because who else am I going to talk to about this?
No, that's an excellent point to bring up, and I'd be interested to see if and how it connects. There are all sorts of interesting reports on Orkney of things called selkies, which were connected to the idea of mermaids or of dolphins that could connect.
Well, we got about less than 6 minutes here, so I want to go to this question. These short statured groups are often associated with fairy tradition in the UK. What is the fairy tradition in New Zealand?
Well, actually a very close match for what we see in Ireland, down to, in Ireland you have what are called fairy mounds, which are cairns whose entryways are so low that a person has to crawl in. An average-sized person today has to crawl in, not walk in standing up. The traditional view on those is, those entryways were kept low, to keep animals out or to make it more thermally, keep it from cooling off as quickly and so forth. I've been in some of those cairns, and the difficulty is that the interior doors between chambers in the cairns are also that low. So it doesn't make a lot of sense to me that somebody who is my stature would build a doorway that small. But you have similar structures in New Zealand, built in the same form, with the same low doorways. In New Zealand, any talk about short-statured people, any talk about a fairy tradition is really counter to traditional viewpoints on things, and it's highly controversial. It's pretty controversial even in the UK, but there's more literature about it. There are references to it in New Zealand. I talk about it in my book. There are persistent connections from culture to culture to culture, even down to North American Indian cultures, Native American cultures, where short-statured people described as pygmies are connected with the tradition I'm chasing. Mm-hmm. Even where the Dogon live 8-hour drive across desert from anything you or I would consider to be civilized. And the place where they live is associated with what's interpreted as being a previous group of pygmies who lived there called the Telem. We have this all over the place, including reports of 3 different varieties of pygmies in New Zealand. And in almost every case, the fate of these short stature groups is that they were said to have been hunted to death.
That's so typical.
We have in the Indonesia area, we actually have artifacts, bones that have been excavated of short-statured cultures.
Well, we're going to be sending, as I mentioned in the beginning of the show, a copy of your book to Richard Taylor and Tanya Rogers at Wellington, New Zealand. And that's one of the first things that he and I talked about as a great mystery. He says, we did have some small people living here. And I've forgotten exactly what he said about. So he's going to be so thrilled to get a copy of your book in regards to this. And, it's so exciting to see all the parallels and on all of the links between all of these ancient. I never in my life thought too much about what was going on in Scotland in regards to this, and how you wove them all together made me feel like there was a book that I had that was a reprint of the linking the Great Pyramid to the Irish of all people. Have you ever heard of that theory?
Sure. Yes.
You have too?
Yeah. There a lot of really interesting theories around. I have a much higher stack of things questions I'd like to have time to pursue that I haven't gotten to. Every so often I manage to get down to one of those.
Yeah, well, you're going to get them soon before you pass into the spirit world, because we need that information, brother. I can't tell you how much I enjoyed your work. I learned so much from your work. I always have, but I mean, in this case, it was opening all kinds of other doors that I had thought about a little bit, but didn't have time. Unfortunately, when we do 21st Century Radio, we read everybody's book, and it was a good read. Your book was a good read, especially since I could take my time at less than 200 pages. But some of these other guys, they can't do books in less than 500 and 600 pages, and that can wipe you out during a process. Thank you for joining us, Laird Scranton. I hope you join us again, but please hang on the line so I can say properly goodbye and thank you to you.
Great. Thank you very much for having me on again.
And Dr. Queen Zahara will be joining 21st Century Radio next week.
And breaking news on Talk Radio 680 WCBM, Baltimore, and WCBM.com.